The first thing Maren Aldvik did when she arrived at the Voss farm was look at the roof. Not at the man standing in the yard, not at the house itself, its weathered, clapboard siding the color of old cream, or the way the porch listed slightly to the left, as though the whole structure had been leaning into the wind so long it had forgotten how to stand straight. She looked at the roof. The shingles along the north pitch were curling at their edges, some of them gone altogether, and she could see from the road, even through the gray November light, even with the sky pressing down like a hand over everything, that come January, that roof would not hold against a proper Minnesota winter. She noted this. She filed it away. She did not say anything. "That's the Voss place," said the man who had driven her out from town, a farmer named Knutson, who had known her father and who had arranged this whole thing in the way that older men of that community arranged things, with few words, much implication, and the expectation that everyone involved would simply understand the terms without requiring them to be spoken aloud. He had a way of looking at her that was not unkind, but that contained, somewhere behind his eyes, a calculation she had learned to recognize in the 18 months since Peder died. The calculation of a man deciding how much a woman like her could bear to hear at once. "I can see it is," Maren said. She climbed down from the wagon before Knutson could offer to help her, and she lifted Sophie down after her. Sophie, who was 4 years old and had been asleep against Maren's side for the last 6 miles, and who woke now with the bewildered gravity of a small child deposited into an unknown world. Eric, who was 7 and had ridden the whole way sitting very straight in the back of the wagon because he was trying to be the man of something, jumped down on his own and immediately looked to his mother to see what his face was supposed to do. Maren looked at the roof one more moment. Then she looked at her children, their red noses, their breath coming in small clouds, the way Sophie's coat was already too thin for the cold that was building in the air. The particular cold that Maren had grown up knowing, the kind that didn't just chill you, but made decisions about you, made decisions about what you could and could not survive. Then she looked at the man who had come out of the barn. His name was Thomas Voss. She had been told this. She had been told he was 38, that he had come out from Wisconsin 7 years ago, that he had built the farm himself on land that had taken 3 years to break properly, that his wife had died in childbirth 4 years back, and the child with her, and that since then he had been working the place alone. Knutson had told her all of this in the flat, informational way he might have described the specifications of a piece of equipment, and she had listened in the same way, taking in the facts, setting them in order, not attaching herself to them. What Knutson had not told her was how the man moved. Thomas Voss came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag that was already past any useful purpose, and he walked toward them with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had been alone long enough that he had stopped performing urgency for anyone. He was not tall in a way that announced itself, but he was solid, the kind of solid that comes not from size, but from use, from years of work that had settled into the body and become structural. His face was weathered in the same way the house was weathered, not damaged, but shaped, marked by what it had stood against. He had dark eyes that moved over her and her children with a directness that she recognized because she had it herself, and because of this, she did not find it rude. He looked at the children first, then at her. "Mrs. Aldvik," he said, not a question. Mr. Voss, she said, not a pleasantry. They regarded each other for a moment in the November light, while Knutson made the small sounds of a man who has done his part and is now anxious to be elsewhere. Sophie pressed her face into Maren's hip. Eric stood very straight. Knutson says you can cook, Thomas Voss said. I can cook, Maren said. I can also mend, preserve, keep accounts, and do anything you need done in a garden come spring. I know how to work a farm. I grew up on one. He said your husband was a grain man. He was. Before that, he was a farmer's son, the same as most men out here. She paused. Before that, I was a farmer's daughter. I have not forgotten what I knew. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, not quite anything she could name. He looked at Eric, who was still standing very straight. How old are you? He said to the boy. 7, Eric said. I'll be 8 in February. Can you carry water? Yes, sir. Can you carry wood? Yes, sir. Thomas Voss nodded once, as though this settled something. He looked back at Maren. The arrangement Knutson described, he said. You understand what it is. I understand it, she said. You and the children take the back room. There's a stove in it. It draws well. You cook, you keep the house, you help with whatever needs doing outside when the weather allows. In exchange, you have the roof and the food and a wage, small but real. Come spring, we reassess. Come spring, she said, I will have enough saved to find something else if the arrangement is not working. He looked at her steadily. That's fair, he said. It was the first thing he said that surprised her. Not the words, but the ease of them, the absence of any need to argue the point or qualify it. She filed that away, too. Knutson left before dark, which was early now, the dark coming in from the fields like something that had been waiting all day just beyond the tree line. Maren put the children in the back room with the small stove going and the 2 bags that held everything they owned arranged against the wall. And she stood in the kitchen of Thomas Voss's house and looked at what she had to work with. The kitchen was clean. This surprised her. Not the clean of a man who cleaned for company, the frantic, surface-level erasure of evidence, but the clean of a man who simply kept things in order because disorder cost him time he didn't have. The wood stove was swept out. The pans were hung. The table had been scrubbed recently enough that she could still smell the lye soap. There was flour and salt and a side of bacon and dried beans and a crock of lard and a basket of the last of the autumn's potatoes, going soft now but still usable. And she stood in front of all of it and felt for the first time in longer than she could easily remember something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of having materials, of having something to work with, of being in a position to do rather than merely to endure. She made a soup. It was the practical choice. The potatoes needed using, and soup fed more with less. And she did not know yet what the man's tastes were, or what the children would need to settle them into sleep in an unfamiliar place. She worked quietly, listening to the house. It had the sounds all old houses have, the particular vocabulary of settling wood and wind finding gaps. But underneath that, she could hear Thomas Voss moving in the other part of the house, the measured sounds of a man doing his evening tasks. And she found that she was already beginning to learn the rhythm of him, the way you learn the rhythm of a place you intend to stay in. Not with intention, but with the automatic attention of a person who has survived things by paying close attention to what is around her. Sophie came out of the back room in her stocking feet and stood in the kitchen doorway with her blanket trailing and watched Maren stir the pot. "Is this our house now?" Sophie asked. Maren considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "We are staying here," she said. "For how long?" "For the winter," Maren said. "Maybe longer. We will see." Sophie thought about this. "Is that man going to eat with us?" "I expect so." "He looked at me," Sophie said, with the air of reporting a significant event. "People do that," Maren said. "Come here and let me fix your braid." Thomas Voss ate the soup without comment, which Maren understood to mean he found it acceptable. A man who had spent years eating his own cooking would not have been moved to praise by anything short of a miracle. But he ate 2 bowls of it, and he gave Eric a second piece of bread without being asked. And when Sophie fell asleep at the table, he looked at the child for a moment with an expression that was careful and quiet, and that Maren did not look at for long, because it felt like something private. After the children were in bed, she came back to the kitchen to clean up, and found that he had already cleared the table. He was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the dark. "The north pitch of the roof," she said, because she had been thinking about it since she arrived, and because she was not a woman who held practical concerns back for the sake of social comfort. "It needs work before the snow comes in earnest." He didn't turn from the window. "I know it." "I can help with it. I've patched a roof before." Now he turned. He looked at her with that same direct assessment she had noticed in the yard, and she held it without flinching because she was 31 years old and had buried a husband and kept 2 children alive through a South Dakota winter on almost nothing, and she was not going to be made uncertain by a man simply looking at her. "You patched a roof," he said. "My father's barn. I was 16. It held." Something shifted in his expression, the same almost something she had seen earlier, that thing that was not quite a smile. "All right," he said. "Saturday, if the weather holds." She nodded. She finished washing the pot. She said goodnight in the matter-of-fact way she said most things, and she went to the back room and lay down on the narrow bed beside Sophie, with Eric's breathing steady in the dark across from them, and she listened to the wind working at the eaves of the house and thought about shingles, about the price of shingles, about what she had and what she needed and what could be made to do. She did not think about the man in the other room. She was very deliberate about not thinking about the man in the other room. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. Not the tentative early snow that melts by afternoon, but the real kind. The kind that means it. The kind that settles in and stays. It came down straight and quiet in the windless dark, covering the yard, covering the fields, covering the road back to town that was now, for all practical purposes, closed. By morning there would be 8 inches on the ground, and the world that existed before the snow would seem, as it always did, like something that had happened to other people. What Maren did not know, as she lay in the dark listening to her children breathe, was that Thomas Voss was still standing at the kitchen window, not looking at the snow, but at the light coming from beneath the back room door. The small yellow line of it, the evidence of other people in his house, and that his hands around the coffee cup had gone still in the particular way of a man who has just noticed something he does not yet have words for, and is not sure he wants them. He stood there a long time before he finally looked away, and did not quite manage it. The first week was a matter of learning each other's silences. Maren had lived long enough and poorly enough to understand that a household has a river, has a current, invisible until you step in, and then immediately, undeniably present. You either move with it, or you are turned around by it. She had no intention of being turned around. She woke before Thomas each morning, which she suspected was not what he expected. She had the stove lit and water heating before she heard his boots on the floorboards above. A slow, deliberate sound. The sound of a man who had been waking alone long enough to have no reason to hurry. She did not make a performance of her earliness. She simply did what needed doing. And when he came downstairs and found the kitchen already warm, she did not look up from whatever task her hands were on, and he did not comment. And in this way they established, without discussion, that she was not a guest. The children complicated the silence in ways Maren had not fully anticipated. Sophie was 4, which meant she was made almost entirely of questions. She asked Thomas on the third morning why his eyebrows looked like that. "Like what?" he had said, the first full sentence he'd directed at the child. "Like they're thinking," Sophie said, very seriously. And Thomas had looked at her for a long moment with an expression Maren could not quite read before he said, "They usually are," and went outside. Sophie watched him go with the satisfied air of a person who has confirmed a hypothesis. Eric was more cautious. 7 years old and already carrying something heavier than 7-year-olds ought to carry, which Maren knew was her fault in the way that a mother's grief is always also her children's grief, whether she means it to be or not. He watched Thomas the way he watched all men, with a careful, measuring attention that belonged more to a much older boy. He did his work without being told twice. He did not complain about the cold. When Thomas showed him how to break the ice on the water trough with the butt end of the axe handle, Eric listened with his whole body and then did it correctly on the first try, and Thomas said, "Good," in the flat, economical way of a man who means it but does not know how to make it sound like more. Maren, watching from the barn doorway with her arms full of hay, saw something shift in her son's face at that single word. A small opening, like a crack in winter ice, and felt simultaneously grateful and afraid. The farm was larger than she had first assessed. 3 days in, she began to understand its full scope. The main house, the barn, a lean-to chicken coop that was losing its argument with the wind, a root cellar that was better stocked than she'd expected, and a back field that Thomas had left fallow this year and would, he said in the brief and information-dense way he communicated most things, put to winter wheat in spring. He told her this while they were mending the fence line on the eastern pasture, both of them working in opposite directions from the same broken post, and the telling of it was so offhand, so embedded in the practical context of "here is what this land needs," that it took her a moment to realize He was including her in the future tense. In spring, as though it were already settled. She did not say anything. She kept her hands on the wire. The arrangement, as Knudsen had brokered it, was through April, when the ground thawed and the hardest winter labor gave way to planting season, which was a different kind of work, and one Thomas presumably could manage with hired day labor from town. That was the agreement. 4 months, and then she would need to find another situation or return to her sister in Wisconsin, which she would not do, which was not a real option, which she had not told anyone, including herself, in those direct terms, but which was the truth underneath all the other truths. She had 4 months. She was not building toward spring. She was surviving it. This was what she told herself on the evenings when the children were asleep, and she sat in the back room with her mending and could hear Thomas in the kitchen. The occasional scrape of his chair, the soft knock of a log being added to the fire. Once, memorably, the low sound of him humming something tuneless and unaware of itself, which stopped abruptly in the way of a man who has suddenly remembered he is not alone. She had kept her eyes on her needle and not smiled. Or she had smiled, but only in the direction of the floor where no one could see it. He was not what she had expected. She had expected a harder man. Not cruel. She had not feared cruelty, or she would not have come. But harder in the way of men who have been alone a long time and have let solitude calcify into something permanent and structural, like scar tissue over a break. She had known men like that. Her father had been one. You could press against them all you liked, and nothing gave. Thomas gave. Slowly, and not much, and never in ways he seemed to intend, but it was there. He gave when Sophie asked about his eyebrows, and he answered her as though she were a reasonable person, which she was, but which not all adults remembered. He gave when Eric dropped a full bucket of milk on the 4th day, a disaster, the boy white-faced and rigid with the anticipation of punishment, and Thomas looked at the spreading white pool on the barn floor and said only, "Get the other bucket," without heat, without anything in his voice except the practical fact of what needed to happen next. He gave when Maren, on the 6th evening, could not get the stove to draw properly, and the kitchen was filling with smoke, and she was standing on a chair trying to clear the flue with a rag wrapped around a stick, and Thomas came in from outside and took in the scene and did not say a word about what she was doing wrong, just took the stick from her with one hand and did something she couldn't entirely follow, and the smoke began to clear. And when she said, "What did you do?" he showed her, slowly, the way you show someone a thing you expect them to need to know again. She had added it to her store of knowledge the way she added everything, quietly, thoroughly, without waste. The cold deepened in the 2nd week. It came down from the north with a seriousness that Minnesota cold had, and Kansas cold, she had been told, she had not believed until now, did not quite match. It was a cold with intention. It pressed against the walls of the house with the patience of something that understood it would eventually win. She found Thomas in the barn one morning, reinforcing the walls with straw bales, packing them against the interior with the methodical focus he brought to most physical tasks. She had come to fetch eggs, and instead stood in the doorway watching him work for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before she said, "I can help with that." He looked at her over his shoulder. His breath made a small cloud in the cold air. "Other side," he said. They worked for 2 hours without speaking more than was required to coordinate the work. And Maren thought, not for the first time and with the same slight unease, that she had never in her life been so comfortable in silence with a person she had known less than 2 weeks. Lars had needed to fill silence the way some men needed to fill a glass. She had loved him. She had sometimes found it exhausting. This was different. This was silence that felt less like absence and more like weather, simply a condition of the place, something you moved through rather than waited out. When they finished, Thomas stood back and looked at the walls with the expression of a man performing a calculation. Then he said, without preamble, Josephine hated the cold. Maren went still. He said it the way he said most things, not as an invitation exactly, but not as a wall either. A statement of fact that had, perhaps, been sitting in the room with him for a while and had simply, finally, come out. She did not ask who Josephine was. She already knew, in the way you come to know the shape of a wound before you know its history, simply by watching how a person moves around it. My Lars, she said after a moment, was the opposite. He would have stood in a blizzard and called it refreshing. Something moved across Thomas's face, not quite a smile, the country adjacent to one. Sounds like a difficult man to dress for winter, he said. Every year, she said. Every year without fail. And then neither of them said anything more, and they walked back to the house in the cold, and it was ordinary, and it was not ordinary at all. And Maren did not examine it too closely, the way you do not look directly at the sun, not because it is dangerous, but because you already know it is there, and you are not yet ready to know what to do about that. It was Eric who first said the thing that Maren had been carefully not thinking. 3 weeks in, she was braiding Sophie's hair by the fire, and Eric was sitting on the floor with a piece of wood he'd found, and was doing something to it with a small knife Thomas had given him. For whittling, Thomas had said, showing him the angle of the blade. And Maren had watched her son receive this gift with both hands and both eyes, and something that was too careful to be called joy, but was in the same family. And Eric said, without looking up from his work, "Do you think he's lonely?" Maren's hands paused in Sophie's hair. "Who?" she said, though she knew. "Mr. Voss," Eric said. He kept his eyes on the wood. "He has a whole house, and he was the only one in it." Maren finished the braid. She tied it off. "Some people prefer their own company," she said. Eric considered this with the gravity he brought to most things. "I don't think he does," he said. "I think he just got used to it." Maren looked at her son, 7 years old, thin-shouldered, already too perceptive for his own peace of mind, and felt the peculiar vertigo of a child saying the true thing the adult has been standing next to and declining to touch. "Finish your whittling," she said. "It's nearly bed." But after the children were asleep and she was in the kitchen filling the lamp, she stood for a moment at the window. The same window she had noticed where Thomas sometimes stood, and looked at the dark field and the darker tree line beyond it, and thought about a man who had gotten used to something without choosing it, and whether getting used to a thing was the same as wanting it, and whether there was, in the end, any difference that mattered. She heard his boots on the stairs. She moved away from the window before he reached the bottom. What she did not know, could not have known, was that Thomas had found, tucked into the frame of the back room door where the wood had warped slightly and left a narrow gap, a small flat stone with a hole worn through its center, a thing Eric had placed there 3 days ago, carefully, without comment. Thomas had held it in his palm for a long moment, understanding it was not accidental. Understanding it was the kind of gift a child gives when they have decided, without quite meaning to, that a place is theirs. He had put it back exactly where he found it. He had not mentioned it to anyone, but he had not taken it away. And in the particular grammar of a man like Thomas Voss, this was not nothing. This was, in fact, the opposite of nothing. And some part of him, the part that had been careful for 4 years, was beginning to understand that the careful part was losing ground. He did not know what to do with that yet, but he kept the stone where it was. The stone was still on the windowsill. Sigrid noticed this the morning after she had placed it there, noticed it the way she noticed most things, which was to say completely and without announcement. She had stood at the kitchen doorway in the gray pre-dawn light, her wool socks pulled up to her knees and her hair still loose from sleep, and she had looked at the stone and then at the window and then at the room beyond. She had not smiled. She was not a child who smiled at conclusions. She simply filed the information away in the orderly interior library where she kept everything that mattered, and then she went to help her mother with the bread. This was how Sigrid moved through the world, quietly, and with the patience of someone who understood that the most important things happened in the spaces between what people said out loud. She had decided about Thomas Voss in the first week, not in the way her mother decided things. Maren's decisions came after a period of visible deliberation, a narrowing of the eyes, a stillness that meant she was weighing. Sigrid's decisions arrived the way weather arrived, completely and without asking permission. One moment the sky was open and the next it was not, and there was no use discussing the interval. What she had decided was this: he was not pretending. This required some explanation, even to herself. She had met adults who were pretending, who arranged their faces into the shapes of kindness and spoke in the careful voices of people performing goodwill for an audience. She had met the neighbor women who brought food after her father died and said, "You poor dears," in voices that were really saying, "How fortunate I am not to be you." She had met the men at the church who spoke to her mother in slow, deliberate tones, as though grief had made Maren simple. She had met the Knutson children who pretended not to notice that the Aldvik family had arrived at their farm with everything they owned in 2 trunks. Thomas Voss was not pretending. He was not being kind. He was not performing patience or warmth or welcome. He was simply present. When he spoke to Eric about the animals, he spoke to Eric as though Eric's attention to the answer was a reasonable expectation. When he moved around the kitchen, he moved around Maren the way you moved around furniture you respected, accommodating its presence without resenting it. When he looked at Sophie, there was something in his face that was not performance. It was something older and quieter than performance, something that had been put away in a drawer and was now, apparently, being taken out again. Sigrid noticed all of this and said none of it to anyone. She did not tell her mother because her mother was busy surviving, and Sigrid understood. With the particular wisdom of an 8-year-old who had watched her father die slowly and her mother reorganized the entire architecture of their lives in the weeks that followed, that her mother could only attend to one project at a time. The current project was winter. Sigrid would not complicate it. The first conflict arrived on a Tuesday in December, as conflicts so often do, not on a day that had announced itself as significant, but on an ordinary day that became significant through accumulation. It began with the bread. Maren had established, in the wordless negotiations of the first weeks, a particular rhythm to the household. She rose first, she made the bread, she had the kitchen organized before Thomas came downstairs, and this was not servility. It was, as Sigrid understood it, a form of argument. Her mother was telling Thomas Voss every morning through the medium of flour and heat, "I am not here because I cannot manage. I am here because I need a roof, and I have paid for it, and we are even." Thomas had apparently understood this, because he accepted the bread each morning with the nod of a man receiving something he had not asked for, but recognized as a fair exchange. But on this Tuesday, Thomas had been up before Maren. Sigrid did not know why. She had come downstairs in the early dark to find him already at the kitchen table with the lamp lit, not eating, not working, just sitting with his hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He had looked up when she appeared in the doorway and had not seemed startled, which Sigrid noted approvingly. Adults who startled easily were adults who were not paying sufficient attention to their surroundings. "Can't sleep?" he said. "I sleep fine," Sigrid said, which was true. She had simply woken and come downstairs, as she sometimes did, to look at the farm in the dark and think her thoughts in the particular quality of silence that existed before the household came alive. She had not expected company. She looked at his cold coffee. "That's cold," she said. "I know." "Why are you drinking cold coffee?" "I'm not drinking it," Thomas said. "I'm sitting with it." Sigrid considered this. It seemed like a reasonable distinction. She climbed onto the bench across from him and folded her hands on the table in the manner of someone prepared to conduct a meeting. Thomas looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but the precursor to it, the landscape before the weather. "You want something?" he said. "No," Sigrid said. "I'm just sitting." "Like me." "Like you," she agreed. They sat in the early dark together for a while, and Sigrid thought her thoughts, and Thomas apparently thought his, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence, which was, Sigrid decided, another point in his favor. Then Maren came downstairs. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair half braided and her expression already organized for the day, and she stopped when she saw them, the two of them at the table in the lamplight, her daughter sitting across from Thomas Voss with the gravity of a small diplomat. And something moved across her face that Sigrid could not entirely read. "Sigrid," Maren said, "you shouldn't be bothering Mr. Voss." "She isn't," Thomas said. Maren looked at him. He looked back. It was a brief exchange, but Sigrid felt the quality of it, the slight adjustment of pressure in the room, the way two people recalibrate their distance when something unexpected has occurred. "Come help me with the bread," Maren said to Sigrid. "I can help," Thomas said. It was not an offer made with any particular inflection. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, as a statement of fact. "I can help," This is available. Take it or leave it." Maren's hands stilled on her apron strings. "I don't need help with bread," she said. "I know you don't need it," Thomas said. "I said I can help." The distinction landed in the room like something dropped. Sigrid watched her mother's face process it, watched the slight tightening around the eyes that meant Maren was recalibrating, deciding whether this was an intrusion or an offer, whether to accept it was to lose something or to gain something, or merely to acknowledge that the situation was more complicated than she had arranged it to be. "I have a system," Maren said finally. "I know you do," Thomas said. "I've watched it for 3 weeks." Another silence, longer this time. "Then why," Maren said with a precision that Sigrid recognized as dangerous, "would you suggest changing it?" Thomas looked at her steadily. He was not a man who looked away from difficult things, Sigrid had noticed. He met them directly and without flinching, which was either courage or stubbornness, or some combination that made the distinction irrelevant. "I'm not suggesting changing it," he said. "I'm suggesting that it's my kitchen, and I know where the salt is kept. And this morning, I happen to be awake." The words "my kitchen" fell into the room, and neither of them seemed to know quite what to do with them. Sigrid looked at her mother. Maren had gone very still. Not the stillness of anger, but the stillness of a woman who has just been reminded of something she had been carefully not thinking about. This was his house. This was his kitchen. The bread she made every morning in the particular way she made it, with the particular rhythm she had established, in the particular arrangement she had built. All of it was built on his floor, in his space, at his sufferance. She had not forgotten this, but she had, perhaps, stopped feeling it every moment. And now she was feeling it again. "Fine," Maren said, and her voice was even. "The salt is on the shelf by the window." "I know where it is," Thomas said. "Then you don't need me to tell you," Maren said. And she moved to the counter and began measuring flour with the focused attention of a woman who has decided that the best response to complication is work. Sigrid watched all of this from her place at the table. She was very still. She had learned early that stillness made adults forget she was there. And when adults forgot she was there, they continued being themselves, which was far more informative than the versions of themselves they performed for children. She watched her mother's shoulders, the particular set of them, squared, controlled, a little too controlled, which was how you knew it was controlled. She watched Thomas move to the shelf and take down the salt without any ceremony, without any acknowledgement that anything had just happened, which was either great tact or great obliviousness. And Sigrid suspected, from everything she had observed, that it was the former. He was not oblivious. He simply did not announce his awareness. This was, she thought, a quality she recognized. It was something like her own quality, the thing she did, the watching without speaking, the knowing without declaring the knowledge. She had not expected to find it in him. She had not expected to find much of anything in him beyond the basic competencies of shelter and practicality. But here it was, this unexpected resemblance, and she sat with it in the way she sat with most things that surprised her, carefully and without rushing toward a conclusion. The bread was made. Thomas did not help. He drank his cold coffee and then stood and went outside to the barn, and Maren worked in silence, and Sigrid remained at the table until her mother noticed her and sent her to wake her brother and sister. That night, Sigrid lay in the dark and listened to the wind come down off the open fields and move against the house, and she thought about the word "my," the way Thomas had said "my kitchen," without weight, without claim, simply as a fact of geography. And she thought about her mother's face in the moment after, the thing that had moved through it. She thought, "My mother is afraid of needing things." She had known this for a long time, in the way children know things about their parents before they have the language for them. But she was beginning to understand now what the fear was made of, not weakness, not cowardice, but something more precise. Her mother was afraid of what it meant to need something from a specific person. From a neighbor or a church or a general arrangement, need was manageable. It was transactional. It did not ask anything of you except endurance. But from a person, from Thomas Voss, who knew where the salt was kept and sat with cold coffee in the dark and put stones back on windowsills without mentioning it. That was a different kind of needing, and it had different consequences. Sigrid stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind and thought, "She hasn't noticed yet. That's the problem. She's still calling it winter." Below, she could hear the low sound of the house settling, the creak of the floor in the direction of the kitchen. Someone was still awake. She did not go to see who, but in the morning, when she came downstairs, there were 2 cups on the table, both of them cold. The cough started in January. Not dramatically. Nothing about Oscar did anything dramatically. He was a quiet child, the kind who absorbed the world rather than demanding it explain itself. And so when the cough began, it was barely more than a clearing of the throat, a small wet sound in the night that Maren catalogued without alarm, and then catalogued again 3 days later when it had not gone, and again a week after that when it had deepened into something with weight to it, something that lived in his chest and rattled there when she pressed her ear to his back in the dark of the room they shared. She did not say anything to Thomas. It was not his concern. She boiled water with dried thyme she found in the kitchen stores and had Oscar breathe the steam, and she kept him inside on the coldest days, and she told herself it was only winter, only the kind of cough that children got when the air was dry and the cold was long and relentless. She had seen worse. She had seen Eric through worse 2 winters ago, before everything changed. But Oscar was not Eric. He was smaller in ways that went beyond size, more permeable somehow, more open to whatever the world sent through him. He cried when the wind was loud. He hoarded small objects in his coat pocket, a button, a piece of red string, a chip of blue pottery he'd found in the yard the first week and carried ever since as though it were a compass. He was 5 years old and still reached for her hand without looking first, still curled against her side at night with the complete and trusting unconsciousness of an animal that has never been threatened. The cough frightened her in a way she would not name. It was Thomas who noticed, not in the way she would have expected, not with the awkward performance of concern that she'd grown accustomed to from neighbors after Henrik died, The careful faces and the measured words that were really a kind of distance, a way of acknowledging suffering without having to stand inside it. Thomas noticed the way he noticed most things, practically, without ceremony, and then acted on it before she could decide whether to be grateful or defensive. She came in from the hen house one morning in late January to find Thomas crouched in front of Oscar by the kitchen stove, not touching him, just level with him, speaking in the low, unhurried tone he used with the animals. Oscar had both hands wrapped around a tin mug of something steaming and was listening with the serious expression he reserved for information he intended to keep. She stopped in the doorway. "Breathe it slow," Thomas was saying. "Don't rush. Let it sit." Oscar breathed. His small chest rose and fell, and the cough that had been threatening all morning did not come. "What is that?" Maren asked. Thomas looked up, not startled. He'd heard her, she realized, had known she was there. "Pine resin, boiled down with a little lard and some dried mullein I had in the barn. My mother used it." He paused. "It won't cure anything, but it eases the breathing." She looked at her son, who was still focused on the steam with the concentration of someone performing an important task. The rattle in his chest was quieter. She could tell from across the room. "Thank you," she said. The words felt insufficient, and she did not know how to make them larger, so she left them as they were and went to hang up her coat. After that, Thomas made the pine resin preparation twice a week without being asked. He left it on the stove in the mornings, covered with a cloth to keep the heat in, and he never mentioned it, and she never thanked him again, because the first time had already said everything, and repeating it would have made it into something else, would have made it into an acknowledgement of need, which she was not prepared to offer. But Oscar knew. Children always knew. He began to follow Thomas. Not intrusively. He was too quiet for that, too careful of his own smallness in spaces he hadn't yet earned. He would simply appear wherever Thomas was working, at a respectful distance, watching. Maren noticed it first in the barn, where she'd gone to check on the ewes, and found Oscar sitting on an overturned bucket near the door, watching Thomas mend a section of broken stall, with the absorbed attention of someone studying a language they intend to speak. Thomas had not sent him away. He had, as far as she could tell, simply worked around the boy's presence, occasionally explaining what he was doing in the same low, unhurried tone she'd heard him use over the mug of steam. "This piece goes here because it needs to carry the weight of the ones above it. You put a weak piece under a heavy load, and eventually something gives. You want to see?" Oscar slid off the bucket and came closer. Eric would have asked questions. Eric approached the world as a series of problems requiring interrogation. But Oscar simply watched, and then nodded, and then held the piece of wood when Thomas asked him to hold it, with both hands and great seriousness, as though he understood that this was a real contribution and not a kindness extended to a child. Maren watched from the barn door and did not go in. The thing she had not anticipated was how much it would cost her to watch. She had known, in the abstract, that her children needed things she could not give them alone. She had known it the way you know about winter before the first snow falls, intellectually, with a kind of braced readiness that you believe is sufficient until the cold actually arrives. She had prepared herself for the practical deficits, a father's labor, a man's presence in the doorway when strangers came to the farm, the particular quality of safety that she could not manufacture from her own body, no matter how capable that body was. She had not prepared herself for Oscar holding a piece of wood with both hands and looking up at Thomas Boss with an expression of uncomplicated pride. She had not prepared herself for the fact that it would look so easy, that her son would reach for this man's attention with the same unguarded reflex with which he reached for her hand in the dark, and that Thomas would receive it without awkwardness or performance, as though it were simply a thing that was happening, and he was simply a person it was happening to. Henrik had been dead for 14 months. She had not let herself think about what that meant for Oscar, who had been 3 years and 11 months old when his father died, and who had, therefore, almost no memory of being a boy with a father. She had not let herself think about it because thinking about it required also thinking about whether she had failed some fundamental obligation, whether surviving the winter was enough, or whether surviving the winter was only the beginning of a longer accounting she was not yet ready to face. She turned away from the barn door and went back to the house. February settled in like a debt. The cold was the kind that had intention, that pressed against the windows at night and found the gaps in the door frame and moved through the house in slow, invisible currents that Maren tracked by the behavior of the candle flames. She kept Oscar's cough managed with the pine resin and her own preparations and a stubbornness she directed at his small body like a continuous, silent argument. He did not get worse. He did not entirely get better. On the 4th of February, he woke in the night crying, which he almost never did. She was up before the sound had fully formed, already crossing the room, already reaching for him. He was hot. Not alarmingly so. She'd seen alarming, and this was not it. But warm enough that she gathered him and sat with him in the chair by the window and rocked him in the way she hadn't since he was an infant, which he accepted without protest, which told her more than the temperature did. "Mama," he said after a while, "I'm here. Is it still winter?" She looked at the window, which was opaque with frost and showed nothing of the outside world. "Yes," she said, "still winter." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Callum said it ends." She stilled. Callum. He had started calling Thomas that somewhere in January, a small corruption of the surname she'd never fully understood and had not corrected. Thomas had not corrected it either. She had noticed this and filed it away in the same place she filed other things she was not ready to examine. "Did he?" she said. "He said everything ends and then starts again. He said that's what spring is." Oscar's voice was drowsy, moving back toward sleep. "He said the farm knows how." She did not say anything. She held him and looked at the frosted window and felt something shift in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. A slow tectonic movement, the kind you feel before you understand what it means, before the ground has fully decided what it intends to do. "She's still calling it winter," Sigrid had said to no one, in the dark of her own room. Maren had not heard it. but she was beginning to understand it anyway, the way you begin to understand something that has been true for longer than you've been willing to know it. In the morning, Oscar came downstairs before her. She heard him on the stairs, his particular step, lighter than Eric's, more hesitant. And then the sound of the kitchen door, and then Thomas's voice, low and unhurried, and then her son's laugh. A real one, the kind that didn't know it was being listened to. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and looked at the floor. The arrangement had been shelter through winter, labor in exchange, nothing beyond the practical. She had agreed to it with her eyes open and her hands steady and the full knowledge of what she was and was not offering. She had kept her side of it. She had risen first and worked hard and kept herself at a careful distance from anything that would complicate the clean simplicity of what this was supposed to be. But Oscar was 5 years old and had no defenses against wanting things. And Thomas Voss had left a stone on a windowsill and made pine resin twice a week without being asked, and told a small sick boy that spring was coming and the farm knew how. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of all of it, something had become irreversible. She knew it the way you know when a door has been opened in a room where you intended to keep everything sealed. You can close it again, but the air has already moved. She went downstairs. Thomas was at the stove. Oscar was at the table, wrapped in his blanket, both hands around a mug, watching Thomas with the expression she'd seen in the barn, that particular unguarded attention that was the closest thing to worship a 5-year-old could manage without knowing that's what it was. Thomas looked up when she came in. Something moved across his face, not surprise, not performance. Just the simple acknowledgement of her presence in the room, the way you look at something that belongs where it is. "He was up early," Thomas said. "I heard," she said. She went to the stove and stood beside him to pour her coffee, and for a moment they were simply standing there in the kitchen in the early morning light, with her son between them and the cold pressed against the windows, and the farm going on around them in all its ordinary and relentless necessity. And it was the most domestic thing that had happened since November, and neither of them moved away from it. And that was when she understood that Sigrid was right. She was still calling it winter. But her hands, she realized, had stopped being cold. What she did not know, what she would not know until much later, when the knowing would come with a particular kind of grief attached to it, was that Eric had seen them standing there, had stood in the doorway of the kitchen in his socks, with his dark, serious eyes and his father's careful face, and looked at the two of them at the stove, and then at Oscar at the table, and had understood something that Maren had only just begun to understand herself, and had turned around and gone back upstairs without a word. Reverend Thaddeus Prine came on a Thursday in late February, which was the kind of day that made Minnesota feel like a punishment. The wind had been building since before dawn, driving snow sideways off the open fields in long white sheets that stung the face and found every gap in a coat collar with what felt like personal malice. Thomas had kept the children inside and sent Maren to the root cellar for the last of the turnips before the path drifted over entirely, and he was standing at the kitchen window watching the line of spruce trees at the field's edge bend and recover, when he saw the dark shape of a horse and cutter coming up the lane. He recognized the horse before he recognized the man. A big gray gelding, well-fed and well-shod, the kind of animal that belonged to someone who had never needed to choose between a horse's comfort and a family's. He watched the cutter slow and stop near the barn, and watched the man climb down with the careful dignity of someone who had decided that weather was beneath his consideration. And only then did he recognize the black coat and the broad-brimmed hat that Reverend Prine wore regardless of season, as if the Lord's weather did not apply to the Lord's servants. Thomas set down his coffee cup. Maren was still in the root cellar when she heard the knock at the kitchen door. Not the back door, where neighbors came, but the front, which no one used in winter, and came up the cellar steps with her arms full of turnips and her hair blown loose from its pins, to find Thomas already opening it. The Reverend stood in the doorway with snow on his shoulders and a smile that was warm in the way that institutional things are warm, reliably, impersonally, without variation. "Thomas," he said, "I've been meaning to come out for some weeks now. The weather has been unkind." He said this as though the weather were a minor social inconvenience rather than the thing that had kept 3 people and 2 children alive by the margin of a well-stacked woodpile. "Reverend Prine," Thomas stepped back. "Come in." The Reverend came in and removed his hat and saw Maren standing at the kitchen entrance with her arms full of root vegetables and her hair in disarray. And his expression shifted in the smallest possible way. Not to anything unkind precisely, but to something that had formed an opinion and was now confirming it. "Mrs. Aldvik," he said, "I had heard you were here. Reverend." She set the turnips on the table. She did not apologize for her appearance. She had learned, in the years since Gunnar died, that apologizing for the evidence of your own labor was a form of self-erasure she could not afford. "Will you sit?" "Thank you, yes." Sophie appeared in the doorway to the stairs, considered the Reverend with the frank assessment of a 4-year-old, and disappeared again. From upstairs came the muffled sound of Eric's voice, and then Oscar's, the 2 of them engaged in whatever quiet occupation they had found to pass the storm-locked morning. The Reverend accepted coffee and refused food, and settled himself at the table with the ease of a man who had sat at a great many kitchen tables and considered himself welcome at all of them. He spoke first of parish matters, the Hendersons' new baby, the Larson boys' broken arm, the subscription for the church organ that was going more slowly than hoped. Thomas answered where answers were required. Maren moved about the kitchen, beginning the turnips, and listened without appearing to listen, which was a skill she had developed to a considerable precision. It was not until the coffee cups had been refilled and a suitable quantity of ordinary conversation had been dispensed with, that Reverend Prine set his cup down and folded his hands on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man arriving at his actual purpose. "I want to say first," he said, "that I have nothing but sympathy for your circumstances, Mrs. Aldvik. Losing a husband in autumn with winter coming on and 2 young children, it is a very hard situation, a very hard situation indeed." He paused to let the sympathy settle. "And Thomas, you have always been a man of practical good sense. Your father was the same way." Thomas said nothing. Maren kept her knife moving through the turnip. "But I think you must both understand," the Reverend continued, with the gentle inexorability of a man who has never encountered a situation his gentleness could not resolve, "that the town has taken notice, that people talk, and that what people say when they talk is not always, well," he spread his hands, "a widow living in a widower's house, without a formal arrangement of any kind, without, if I may say so, any clear—" "There is a formal arrangement," Thomas said. "She works the farm. I provide the roof and food." "Yes," the Reverend nodded carefully. "Yes, that is one way to describe it. But you see, Thomas, a working arrangement between a man and a woman living under the same roof, it is not quite the same as, say, a hired man. People understand a hired man. People do not—" He paused again, selecting his words with the precision of someone who believed that sufficient delicacy could make anything acceptable. "People find it harder to understand this." Maren set down her knife. She turned from the counter and looked at Reverend Prine directly, and something in the quality of her attention caused him to straighten slightly in his chair. "What is it," she said, "that people find hard to understand?" "Only that, well, the propriety of the situation. My children were going to spend the winter in the Knutson barn," she said. "Sophie is 4 years old. The temperature has been 20 below for 3 weeks. She said it without heat, which made it worse somehow than if she had been angry. Thomas Voss has a sound roof and a working stove and a root cellar with enough to last the winter. I can cook and sew and work a farm. What is it exactly that requires explaining?" The Reverend looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected tears or shame, or at least the performance of apology, and had received instead a clear-eyed accounting of material facts. "I don't question your necessity, Mrs. Aldvik," he said carefully. "I question only the appearance of the thing, what it looks like to others." "I know what it looks like to others," she said. "What it looks like to others is that I am a woman without resources who made the only sensible choice available to her. If others find that troubling, I would suggest that is a difficulty with others." There was a silence. Thomas had not moved from his position near the window. He was looking at the Reverend with an expression Maren had not seen on him before. Not anger, but something adjacent to it, something quiet and very still, like water that has frozen over a current. "Reverend," he said, "what is it you're suggesting?" Prine shifted in his chair. "I am suggesting nothing improper, Thomas. I am suggesting only that, if the arrangement is to continue past the winter, if Mrs. Aldvik and her children are to remain here, that some formal acknowledgement might be—" "She is here through the winter," Thomas said. "That was the arrangement." "Yes? And after the winter?" The question landed in the kitchen and stayed there. Maren had picked up her knife again. She was looking at the turnip on the board in front of her, and not at Thomas, and she was aware, with a precision that was almost painful, that the Reverend had just asked aloud the question that had been living in the house for weeks without a name. "After the winter," Thomas said, "is after the winter." The Reverend stayed another quarter hour, during which he drank the rest of his coffee and spoke of spring with the optimism of a man for whom spring had always reliably arrived. And then he retrieved his hat and his coat and shook Thomas's hand at the door with the warmth of someone who believed he had done a kindness, and went back out into the wind. Thomas stood at the door for a moment after the cutter had disappeared down the lane. Then he came back to the kitchen. Maren had finished the turnips and started the pot. She did not turn around. "He means well," Thomas said. "I know he does," she said. "That's what makes it worse." Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. She heard the wood creak under his weight, heard him exhale. Not quite a sigh, but something in that direction. "Maren." She turned then, because he had used her name, which he did rarely enough that it still carried weight when he did. He was looking at the table. His hands were flat on the surface in front of him, and she noticed, not for the first time, how worn they were. The knuckles, the calluses at the base of each finger, the old scar along the right thumb that she had never asked about. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I have not, that there is nothing here that you did not agree to, nothing I expect from you that was not part of the arrangement." He paused. "I want you to know that." She understood what he was saying. She understood that he was drawing a line, clearly and deliberately, between what the Reverend had implied and what was actually true. And she understood that he was doing it to protect her, or to protect both of them, or perhaps to protect the thing that had been quietly growing between them from the weight of being examined before it had been named. "I know that," she said. "Good," he said, and then, after a moment, "Good." He stood up and went back to the window, and they were quiet together in the way that they had learned to be quiet. Not the absence of communication, but a different kind of it. That night, after the children were in bed and the fire had been banked and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, Maren sat at the table with her mending and turned the Reverend's question over in her mind like a stone. After the winter. She had not let herself think past March. She had constructed her thinking in monthly increments. November, December, January, February. Because that was how you survived things, by refusing to look at the whole of them. But the Reverend had said it now, and now it was in the room, and she could not put it back. She thought about Sophie's laugh, which had come back slowly over the past weeks, and now appeared with some regularity, surprised out of her by Thomas's dry observations and Eric's deliberate clowning. She thought about Oscar following Thomas through the barn like a small, serious shadow. She thought about Eric, who had seen something at the stove and turned around and gone upstairs without a word, and who had been quietly, carefully watchful of her ever since, in a way that reminded her of Gunnar so sharply it made her chest ache. She thought about her hands, which had stopped being cold. After the winter. The fire shifted in the stove. Upstairs, one of the children turned in sleep. The house was quiet and warm and full of a life that had not been there in November, and Maren sat in the middle of it, with her mending in her lap, and understood, with a clarity that felt like standing at the edge of something, that she had already stopped thinking of spring as an ending. She did not know what to do with that. What she did know, what she felt suddenly with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the weather, was that she was not the only one who had noticed. Tomorrow was Sunday, and on Sunday Reverend Prine would stand at his pulpit in front of every family in the county, and he would have had a night to think about what he had seen in Thomas Voss's kitchen and what he intended to do about it. The sermon was not about her. That was the first thing Maren noticed, sitting in the third pew from the back with Sophie pressed warm against her left side and Eric rigid and watchful on her right. Both children scrubbed to a shine that cost her 40 minutes and considerable negotiation. The sermon was about Ruth and Naomi, which was perhaps worse than being named outright, because everyone in the congregation could hear the subtext without Reverend Prine having to commit to it. Whither thou goest, the bonds of obligation, the question of what a woman owes and to whom. Thomas sat 4 rows ahead, alone as he always sat, his shoulders set in that particular way he had when he was keeping still, with effort rather than ease. Maren kept her eyes on her hymnal and thought about the roof. Dorothea Fenwick came to the farm on a Wednesday. Maren was in the yard splitting kindling when she heard the horse, and she stood up straight and watched the woman come down the lane with the particular attention of someone who has learned to read arrivals. Dorothea Fenwick drove her own wagon, a good one, the kind that said, "I do not need anyone to drive me," and she sat in it the way prosperous women sit, with her back very correct and her coat buttoned to the throat, despite the March air having gone soft and almost forgiving. She was 52, Maren knew, though she had learned this through the sideways method of small-town information rather than any direct introduction. A widow, 2 sons, both grown, both working the farm their father had left in reliable condition. A woman who had never needed to negotiate a winter. She pulled the horse up at the fence and looked at Maren with an expression that was not unfriendly and not friendly either, but something more careful than both. "Mrs. Aldvik," she said. "Mrs. Fenwick?" Maren set down the hatchet. "Thomas is in the north field. I didn't come to see Thomas Voss." Dorothea Fenwick climbed down from the wagon with the practiced ease of a woman who had been climbing down from wagons for 30 years and expected to be climbing down from them for 30 more. She tied the horse herself. She came through the gate herself. She looked at the yard, the split wood stacked in neat rows against the barn wall, the mended fence post, the children's boots drying on the south-facing step, and Maren watched her looking, because it was important to know what she saw. "I thought I would call," Dorothea said, which was not an explanation. "Come in, then." The kitchen was clean. Maren had made sure of that since November, but she was aware, as she opened the door and let the older woman precede her inside, that this morning she had also left bread rising on the counter and a pot of dried apple compote on the stove, and that these things communicated something she had not exactly intended to communicate, or perhaps had intended without admitting it. The kitchen smelled like a home. She was not certain whether that helped her or not. Dorothea sat at the table without being asked, which told Maren something about her. A woman who waits to be asked is a woman who doubts her welcome. Dorothea Fenwick had not doubted her welcome anywhere in 20 years. Maren poured coffee and sat across from her and waited. "Prine's sermon," Dorothea said. "Yes. He's not a bad man." "I didn't say he was." Dorothea wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at Maren with the expression of someone choosing their words the way a careful person chooses footing on uncertain ground. He's a man who believes that what the town thinks matters, and in a county this small, he is not entirely wrong. She paused. You understand what I'm saying. I understand what you're saying. I'm not here to repeat it. Dorothea set the cup down. I'm here because I wanted to see for myself. Maren felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature. See what, exactly? Whether you're the kind of woman I think you are. Dorothea's voice was even, not unkind, but carrying the weight of someone who has decided that directness is its own form of respect. Because if you are, then the conversation I have with Ingrid Larson at the dry goods next week will go one way, and if you're not, it will go another. The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of the fire and, distantly, Sophie's voice in the yard talking to the dog, in the particular serious tone she used when she believed herself to be conducting important business. "And what kind of woman," Maren said, "do you think I am?" Dorothea looked at her for a long moment. Not the way Reverend Prine had looked at her, not with judgment already assembled and waiting to be delivered, but with the genuine attention of someone who has learned that people will tell you who they are if you look at them correctly. "A woman who has been managing something difficult," Dorothea said finally, "and managing it carefully. The bread, the wood, the way your children look." She glanced toward the window where Sophie's voice continued its serious monologue. "Children who are fed and clean and not frightened. That tells me something. It tells you I'm a decent mother. It tells me you are not a woman who has let herself go slack because a man is providing for her." Dorothea picked up the coffee cup again. "That is not nothing. There are women who would have." Maren said nothing. She was aware that this was, in its way, a compliment, and also that it was a test, and also that the test was not yet finished. "The town is talking," Dorothea said. "You know that." "I know that." "Prine's sermon was a warning. He'll be more direct if nothing changes." She looked at Maren steadily. "What are you planning to do about spring?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Maren had been asking herself the same question for 3 weeks, lying awake in the small hours while the children breathed in their sleep and the house made its nighttime sounds. And she had not yet found an answer that did not cost her something she was not sure she could afford to pay. To stay was to give the town something to say. To leave was to take her children back into a winter that was, admittedly, ending, but that would come again, and the winter after that, and there was still no roof. "I haven't decided," she said. Dorothea nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. "Thomas Voss is a good man," she said. "I've known him 15 years. He was good to his wife. He was destroyed by losing her." She paused. "I watched him those first 2 years. There were men in this county who would have drunk themselves into the ground. He didn't. He just went very quiet, the way a house goes quiet when there's no one in it." Maren's hands were still on the table. She did not move them. "He's not quiet the same way anymore," Dorothea said. "Mrs. Fenwick, I'm not accusing you of anything." Her voice was firm and also, underneath the firmness, almost gentle. I'm telling you what I see, and what I see is a man who has come back to himself somewhat, and two children who have a place to be, and a woman who has been carrying things alone for long enough that she's forgotten it's allowed to set them down. She looked at Maren directly. I'm also telling you that the town will not allow things to continue as they are. Not through another season. Prine will see to that, and Prine has the ear of enough people that it matters. So I should leave? I didn't say that. Then what are you saying? Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Outside, Sophie had apparently concluded her negotiations with the dog and was now calling for Eric in the particular imperious tone that meant she required an audience for something. Somewhere further off, barely audible, there was the sound of Thomas coming back along the fence line, the particular rhythm of his walk that Maren had learned without meaning to, the way you learn the sounds of any house you live in long enough. I'm saying, Dorothea said carefully, that there is a version of this that the town can accept, and there is a version it cannot. And the difference between them is not what is actually happening in this house. It is what is made formal. She held Maren's gaze. You understand me now. Maren understood her. She understood her so completely that for a moment she could not speak, because the thing Dorothea was suggesting, the thing Dorothea was, in her careful, prosperous, socially barometric way recommending, was a thing that Maren had not allowed herself to think about directly, only sideways, only in the dark, only in the moments between sleeping and waking, when the mind's defenses were not fully assembled. That is not a small thing, Maren said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. No, Dorothea agreed. It is not. You're speaking of something that would require... She stopped. It would require both of us. Yes. You can't know what Thomas... No, Dorothea said again. I cannot. She stood then, with the same unhurried certainty with which she had sat, and buttoned the top button of her coat, which she had never unbuttoned. A woman who was not planning to stay long, a woman who had said what she came to say. But I have known Thomas Foss for 15 years, as I said, and I watched him come back from that field just now. She looked at Maren with something that was not quite pity and not quite sympathy, but something older than both. He was not walking like a man who is counting the days until you leave. She set a small wrapped parcel on the table. Dried plums, Maren realized, catching the scent, and moved toward the door. I'll speak well of you, Dorothea said, to Ingrid Larsen and to whoever else asks. That is what I came to tell you. I'll speak well of you, and I'll hold the town off as long as I can hold it. She paused at the door with her hand on the frame. But I am one woman, and Prine is irreverent, and spring is coming. These things have a way of forcing decisions that should perhaps have been made in winter. She left the way she had come, self-sufficient, deliberate, asking nothing. Maren stood in the kitchen and listened to the horse moving back down the lane, and then she stood there a while longer in the silence that remained, the dried plums on the table, and the bread still rising on the counter, and the sound of Thomas's boots now on the porch steps, stopping to scrape the mud off the way he always did. The small, reliable sound of it. He knocked before he opened the door. He had started doing that sometime in January, and neither of them had remarked upon it. But she had noticed, and he knew she had noticed, and there was a whole conversation inside that small courtesy that neither of them had yet found the words for. "Was that Fenwick's horse?" he said, coming in and hanging his coat on the peg. "Yes." He looked at her. He was getting better at looking at her, or she was getting worse at not being looked at. She was no longer certain which. What did she want? Maren looked at the parcel of dried plums. She looked at the bread. She looked at Thomas Voss standing in the kitchen doorway with mud on his boots and his hair pushed back from the cold, looking at her with the expression of a man who was asking a simple question, and also, underneath it, a question that was not simple at all. "She wanted to know what we're planning to do about spring," Maren said. The kitchen held the question between them like a third presence. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in the careful voice of a man choosing his footing, "What did you tell her?" "I told her I hadn't decided." He nodded. He moved to the stove and poured himself coffee and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched his shoulders and thought about what Dorothea Fenwick had said. He was not walking like a man who is counting the days until you leave, and felt the full weight of where they had arrived without ever agreeing to travel here. "Maren," he said. He did not turn around. "Thomas?" "I think," he said, still not turning, his voice very quiet and very careful, and carrying underneath its carefulness something that had been there a long time, "that we should talk." And in the silence before she answered, she heard Sophie coming up the porch steps, and Eric behind her, and the dog's nails on the wood, and the ordinary music of the household in the late afternoon. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost frightening, that she had already made her decision. She just hadn't told him yet. The talk did not happen that evening. Sophie came through the door with a splinter in her thumb and a story about the fence post that required immediate attention and considerable dramatic elaboration, and Eric came in behind her with mud on both knees and the look of a boy who expected to be scolded and was already preparing his defense. And the dog knocked over the water bucket in the entryway, and by the time order had been restored and supper was on the table, the moment had folded itself away like a letter tucked into a coat pocket. Still there, still unread, but not yet. Maren was grateful for it. She needed the hours. She lay awake that night, listening to the particular silence of a Minnesota February that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to soften. Not spring, it was not spring yet, but something in the cold had shifted its quality, the way iron shifts from black to deep red before it becomes fire. She could hear it in the wind, which no longer had that cutting, declarative edge. She could feel it in the air that came through the gap at the window frame, which was still cold but no longer hostile. The season was considering something. So was she. She had already made her decision. She had known it in the silence before she answered him, in the sound of her children coming up the steps, in the ordinary and unremarkable music of a household that had, without her full permission, become hers. What she had not yet determined was whether the decision was the right one, and whether those two things, what she had decided and what was right, were the same. She thought about Thomas She thought about the pine resin remedy he had made for Oscar without being asked, the way he had explained the harness to Eric, as though the boy's questions were reasonable and worth answering. The morning she had found him in the kitchen with his cold coffee and his unreadable expression, and the weight of something he had not yet put down. She thought about the stone on the windowsill, which was still there. She thought about Henrik Dahl. He had come on a Tuesday, 2 weeks prior, arriving in a good sleigh with a good horse and a manner that was comfortable and unhurried, the manner of a man who had thought carefully about the impression he wanted to make, and had then practiced it into something that looked natural. He was 45, broad-shouldered, with a fair beard gone partly to gray, and the kind of steady, uncomplicated blue eyes that suggested a life without excessive complication. He brought seed grain. The seed grain was real. She had examined it, and it was quality stock, but it was also, transparently, a reason. Thomas had brought him inside, because that was what you did, and Maren had made coffee because that was what she did. And the three of them had sat at the kitchen table while Henrik talked about the mild spell they'd had in January and the price of oats and the condition of the roads between his farm and the Brody place. He had a farm 12 miles east. He had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, the youngest of whom was 8, and he had been without a wife for going on 3 years. He did not say any of this directly. He said it the way men like him said things, which was sideways and carefully, watching to see what landed. He had looked at Maren the way a man looks at a woman when he is trying to determine whether she is what he has been told she is. Not unkindly, assessingly. She had looked back at him with the same directness because she had learned in the past several years that there was no advantage in pretending not to understand what was happening. He was not a bad man. That was the thing she kept returning to in the weeks after his visit. He was not a bad man in any way she could specifically identify. He was decent and established, and his farm was solvent, and his children needed a mother, and the town would have approved of it completely, would have exhaled with something very close to relief. Reverend Prine would have called it providential. Dorothea Fenwick would have nodded with satisfaction. The arrangement would have been clean and legible and properly sanctioned, and Maren and her children would have had a roof and a future that the community could look at without discomfort. He had asked Thomas near the end of the visit whether he might call again. He had looked at Maren when he asked it. Thomas had said that was for Maren to decide. And Maren had said, with perfect courtesy, that she was grateful for the visit and the seed grain, and had not answered the question directly. And Henrik Dahl had driven his good sleigh back toward his farm 12 miles east, and Thomas had gone out to the barn, and Maren had stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the sleigh until it disappeared into the white. He came again on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of February. This time he did not bring seed grain. He brought a cloth-wrapped parcel of smoked fish from his own smokehouse, which he gave to Maren directly rather than to Thomas. And he accepted coffee and sat at the table with a calm and patient air that suggested he was prepared to wait as long as the situation required. Thomas found something to do in the far barn. Maren understood that Thomas had made himself absent on purpose, and she was not certain how she felt about that. Henrik talked to her the way a man talks to a woman he is courting when he is trying to do it properly. He asked about her children with genuine interest. He remembered their names, which she noted, and he spoke about his own farm with the measured pride of a man who had built something and wanted credit for it without appearing to want credit. He was careful and considerate, and she found herself, almost against her will, respecting the effort he was making. "Your children would have room," he said eventually. He said it quietly, without pressure, looking at his coffee cup. "My youngest, Astrid, she's 4 years older than yours, but she's a gentle girl. She'd be good with them." "I'm sure she would," Maren said. He looked up. "I'm not a man who needs to be managed," he said. "I want you to know that. I had a good marriage. I know what it looks like." She believed him. That was the difficulty. "Mr. Dahl," she said. "Henrik." "Henrik." She folded her hands on the table. "I appreciate your honesty. I want to be honest in return. I have not made any decisions about my situation." "That's fair," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I heard about Prine's visit." "I imagine most people have." "It's not fair," he said, with a directness that surprised her. "What they're implying. You're a woman trying to keep her children alive through a hard winter. There's no shame in that." She looked at him carefully. "No," she said, "there isn't." "But the talk won't stop on its own," he said. "You know that." "I know that." He left the smoked fish and drove his sleigh back east, and this time he said, before he left, that he hoped she would think about what a life with room in it might look like. He said it gently. He was not wrong to say it. She was still thinking about it on the morning after Thomas had said, "I think we should talk," which was a Saturday, when she came downstairs to find the kitchen already warm and Thomas already at the table with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that had clearly been prepared and then reconsidered several times before she arrived. She sat down across from him. She took the coffee. Outside, the sky had the particular pale quality of February light that was beginning, reluctantly, to remember the existence of the sun. "He came twice," Thomas said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the table, at his hands. "Dahl?" "Yes." "He's a decent man." "Yes," she said, "he is." Thomas was quiet. She could see something working in him, something he was trying to find the right shape for, and she did not help him. She had learned in the months since November that Thomas needed to arrive at things himself, that he could not be led to them. "He can give you things," Thomas said finally. "A house that's already standing, children who are already half grown, a name the town won't question." He paused. "I am aware of what I'm not." "Are you?" she said. He looked up then. His eyes were very direct, the way they always were when he stopped being careful. "Maren," he said, "I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, because I'm not a man who does this well. I don't have the words for it. I've been trying to find them since January, and I haven't found them. So I'm going to say it plainly, and you can do with it what you want." She waited. "I don't want you to go," he said. "Not because of the farm, not because of the hands, or the winter, or the arrangement. I want you to stay because—" He stopped. He pressed his mouth together. Because this house has been alive since November in a way it wasn't before. Because your children, he stopped again. Because you. The word landed in the kitchen like something solid, like a stone placed on a windowsill. She looked at him for a long moment. The February light was coming through the window behind him, and she could hear distantly Eric's voice from somewhere outside, and the dog's answering bark, and the ordinary sounds of a morning that had become, somehow, the morning everything turned on. "Henrik Dahl," she said carefully, "is a good man with a good farm, and he would be kind to my children, and the town would approve, and I would never have to worry about what Reverend Prine thought of me again." "I know," Thomas said. He did not look away. "And you," she said, "are a man I have lived beside for 3 months in a leaking farmhouse in a Minnesota winter, and I have watched you make medicine for my son without being asked, and I have watched you teach my older boy how to tie a harness knot, and I found you once in this kitchen at 4 in the morning with cold coffee you weren't drinking, and I have never once asked you what that was about." Thomas was very still. "What was it about?" she said. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, very quietly, "The day my wife died, she asked me to come in from the field. I didn't come. I thought it could wait." He paused. It couldn't wait. The kitchen held the words. "Thomas," she said. "I'm not asking you to fix that," he said quickly. "I'm not asking you for anything you don't—" "Thomas," she said it again, more firmly, and he stopped. She looked at him across the table, at this man who had carried 4 years of that particular weight alone in this house, who had put a stone on a windowsill and thought no one noticed. "I'm not going to Henrik Dahl's farm." He looked at her. "I made my decision," she said. "I made it before you asked. I just needed to hear you say it." The silence between them was different now. It had changed its nature entirely, the way the season outside was changing. Not arrived yet, not completed, but committed. Something had been said that could not be unsaid, and the room knew it, and they both knew it. And the knowing was neither simple nor frightening, but was instead the particular feeling of a door that has been closed for a long time, finally standing open. Thomas set down his coffee cup. He started to say something. She could see him beginning to say something, something she thought she might want to hear. And then the back door opened, and Sophie came in from the cold with both cheeks red and her coat misbuttoned and her eyes very bright, and she looked at the two of them sitting at the table in the early morning light and said, with the devastating perceptiveness of a 4-year-old, "Are you two talking about something important?" "Yes," Maren said. Sophie considered this. "Can I have bread?" "Yes," Thomas said, and his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Sophie climbed onto the bench beside him with the comfortable ease of a child who has decided where she belongs, and reached for the bread, and the three of them sat in the February kitchen while the light outside continued its slow and tentative return. It was only later, much later, when Sophie had gone back outside and the kitchen was quiet again, that Maren found the folded paper on the table where Thomas had been sitting. She opened it. It was a deed, the farm's deed. And beside Thomas's name, in handwriting she did not recognize, there was a second line that had been added recently, the ink still sharp, the letters careful and deliberate. Her name. She stood in the kitchen holding the paper, and she understood that Thomas had not been trying to find words since January. He had been trying to find the courage to show her what he had already done. She did not go to Lottie Crane's store with intention. She went because she needed salt, and because the children needed new bootlaces, and because she had been standing in the kitchen holding that folded deed for a long time. Long enough that the light through the window had shifted, long enough that her hands had grown cold, even indoors. And she needed somewhere to put herself that was not that kitchen, not that farm, not the place where Thomas Voss had quietly written her name onto the thing he loved most in the world, without asking her permission or requiring her answer. She left the deed on the table exactly where she had found it. She hitched the mare herself, loaded Eric and Sophie into the wagon, and drove the 6 miles to Harlan Crossing without speaking much. The children understood, the way children understand things they cannot articulate, that their mother was occupied with something interior, and they let her be. Sophie sang to herself. Eric watched the tree line. Lottie Crane's dry goods store smelled, as it always did, of coffee and sawdust and the particular sweetness of dried apples kept in barrels near the back wall. It was the smell of a place that had been reliably itself for a long time, and Maren had come to depend on that reliability more than she had ever admitted. Lottie was behind the counter, tallying a column of figures when Maren came through the door, and she looked up once, assessed the situation with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 20 years reading faces across a counter, and said only, "Eric, there are peppermints in the jar by the window. You can take 2. Take 3. Eric looked at his mother. Maren nodded. He took Sophie by the hand and led her toward the jar with the gravity of a boy entrusted with important work, and Lottie came around the counter and put the kettle on the small iron stove in the corner without being asked. "Sit," she said. Maren sat. She did not say anything for a while, and Lottie did not require her to. This was one of the things Maren valued most about Lottie Crane. She had no appetite for the performance of concern. She did not lean forward with her elbows on her knees and her head tilted at the sympathetic angle. She simply made tea and set a cup on the table and pulled a chair to the opposite side and sat down with her own cup and waited, the way a person waits for weather to declare itself. "He put my name on the deed," Maren said finally. Lottie drank her tea. "Did he ask you first?" "No." "Did he explain it?" "He left it on the table, folded. He wasn't in the room when I found it." Lottie considered this. Outside, one of her customers came to the door, saw her occupied, and apparently decided whatever they needed could wait, because the door did not open. Lottie had that effect on people. "That sounds like Thomas Voss," she said. "You know him?" "I've sold him seed and flour and lamp oil for 11 years. A man tells you something about himself over 11 years, whether he means to or not." She set her cup down. "He came in last October and bought extra wool batting. More than one man needs." "I didn't ask him why." Maren looked at her hands around the warm cup. He did it without asking me. Yes. That's... She stopped. It's presumptuous, Lottie said without heat. It's also something else. What? It's a man who has been alone long enough that he's forgotten how to ask for things he wants. He's only remembered how to arrange for them. Lottie's voice carried no particular judgment in either direction. She was describing a condition, the way she might describe a roof that had been neglected through several seasons, not condemning the roof, simply naming what had happened to it. That's not the same as a man who takes. You know the difference. Maren did know the difference. She had been thinking about it since January, since before January, since the first morning she had come downstairs to find Thomas already awake at the kitchen table with his cold cup of coffee, sitting in the dark not because he was brooding, but because he had nowhere else to put the weight of himself at 4 a.m, and he had not wanted to disturb her rest by lighting the lamp. Henrik Dahl came back Thursday, she said. I heard. He's a good man. He is, Lottie agreed. He's also a man who would require you to become a particular kind of woman in order to fit the particular kind of life he already has arranged. She said it without malice. That's not a condemnation. That's just what that situation would be. You'd know it inside a year. Maren was quiet for a moment. In the corner, Sophie was holding a peppermint up to the window light to look through it, turning it in her fingers like a small red lens. Eric was reading the labels on seed packets with the focused seriousness he brought to everything. What I'm afraid of, Maren said, and then she stopped, because she had not said this out loud before, and the words felt unsteady, is that I agreed to the arrangement because I needed to survive the winter. And now I can't tell anymore whether what I feel is real or whether it's just gratitude, dependency, whether I'm confusing safety for something more than safety. Lottie looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Can I ask you something plain? Yes? When you walk into a room and he's in it, does your thinking get quieter or louder? Maren opened her mouth and then closed it. That's your answer, Lottie said. She stood and refilled the kettle, not because it needed refilling, but because she was a woman who occupied herself with useful tasks when a conversation required the other person to sit with something. Gratitude makes thinking louder. It makes you busy and alert and calculating what you owe and what you've received and whether the accounts balance. What you're describing sounds like the other thing. I'm afraid of the other thing. I know you are. Lottie came back and sat down. You've been surviving so long you've gotten very good at it. And now something is asking you to do something besides survive. And it feels dangerous because you don't have practice with it. She looked at Maren with the direct, unsentimental regard that had always felt to Maren like the most honest form of kindness available. It is a little dangerous. I won't tell you otherwise. But the danger isn't him. She drove home in the late afternoon, the children drowsy in the wagon bed, the sky over the fields turning the particular pale gold of an April evening in Minnesota, that tentative, almost apologetic gold, as if the light were not yet certain of its welcome after so long an absence. The farm came into view, and she saw Thomas in the near field, not working, just standing at the fence line, looking at the turned earth. He had his coat on still, but his hat was off, and the evening light was on his face, and he was not looking at her, not yet, because he did not know she was coming. She watched him for a moment before he heard the wagon. He turned when he heard it. He did not move toward her or away. He simply turned and looked, the way a man looks when he has set something down and is waiting to learn whether it will be picked up or left where it fell. She stopped the wagon. She told Eric to take his sister inside and wash for supper. She waited until their footsteps had crossed the porch and the door had opened and closed. Then she climbed down from the wagon and walked to the fence line. Thomas watched her come. He had the look of a man bracing himself, not dramatically, just the quiet internal bracing of someone who has learned that the things he wants tend to require a reckoning. She stopped a few feet from him. "You should have asked me," she said. "Yes," he said, "I should have." "It wasn't yours to decide alone." "No." He held her gaze. "I know that. I knew it when I did it, and I didn't." He stopped. He looked at the field. "I didn't know how to make my mouth form the question. I've been trying since January." "I know," she said. "I know you have." He looked back at her. "I went to see Lottie Crane today," Maren said. "All right." "She told me something." She paused. "She said that gratitude makes thinking louder, that it makes you busy and calculating." She watched his face. "I want you to know that when I'm in a room with you, my thinking gets quieter. I've been trying to decide for months whether that was safe to tell you." Thomas was very still. "It's safe," he said. His voice was low and careful, and entirely without performance. "I know that now." She looked at the field, at the dark turned earth that smelled of iron and possibility, at the furrows that would hold seed in another week. "I'm not agreeing to anything because it's April and I need a roof. I want you to understand that. I'm agreeing because I have been paying attention to you since November, and I know what I've seen." "What have you seen?" he asked, not demanding it, asking it the way a person asks when they genuinely do not know the answer. She thought about the pine resin remedy he had made twice weekly without acknowledgement. She thought about Eric's face the first time Thomas had said a plain word of praise to him, how something had cracked open in the boy that had been sealed shut since his father's death. She thought about Sophie's red stone on the windowsill. She thought about a man sitting alone at 4 a.m. with cold coffee, not wanting to wake her with the lamp. "A man who is careful with things," she said. "With small things especially. The kind of careful that doesn't ask to be noticed." He was quiet for a long moment. The evening light moved across the field. "The deed was wrong," he said finally. "The way I did it. I'll have it changed or whatever you want. I won't hold you to something I did without your voice in it." "I don't want it changed," she said. He looked at her. "I want it to have been done differently, but I don't want it undone." She met his eyes. "There's a difference." Thomas nodded slowly. Something in his face shifted. Not the dramatic unburdening of a man released from great weight, but the quieter adjustment of a man who has been braced for a long time and is cautiously, carefully, trying to remember what it feels like not to be. "The children," he said. Eric will need time. He's his father's son and he holds things close. She paused. But he's been watching you since December. You may not have noticed. I noticed. Sophie has already decided, Maren said, and something almost like a smile moved across her face. She decided in November. You may as well know you've been outvoted. Thomas looked down at his hat in his hands. He turned it once by the brim, slowly. When he looked up again, there was something in his expression she had not seen before. Or rather, something she had seen in pieces, in fragments, in the corner of a room and the edge of a moment, but never all at once, and never directed openly at her. I didn't agree to this either, he said. In November. I want you to know that. I wasn't planning for anything except getting through to spring. Neither was I, she said. And yet, she agreed. Later, after supper, after the children were in bed and the kitchen was cleaned and the lamp was burning low on the table between them, Maren took the deed from where she had left it folded and set it on the table between them. They did not talk about it in large terms. They were not people who dealt in large terms. They talked about what would need to be done in the south field before the end of the week, and whether the roof over the east corner of the barn would hold through another season or needed addressing now, and whether Eric might be ready by summer to take on more responsibility with the animals, and what Sophie had said at supper that had made Thomas almost laugh, almost, nearly, the sound arriving and then retreating, but arriving. The deed stayed on the table between them, both their names on it, sharp and deliberate in the lamplight. Outside, the April night was cold still, the way Minnesota April nights are cold. Not the killing cold of January, but the cold of a world that has remembered warmth and is moving toward it with the particular stubbornness of things that intend to survive. The farm was quiet. The children slept. Maren poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Thomas, and kept one for herself. And they sat across from each other at the kitchen table in the lamplight. And neither of them said anything for a while, and neither of them needed to. She had come in November with 2 children and no roof. He had been alone for 4 years, with more land than one man's hands could tend. Neither of them had agreed to this, but here, in the small and particular light of what they had built without intending to build it, neither of them was inclined to argue with what April had made of them.